The book Brave New World by Aldous Huxley is a story of unintended consequences, how unlimited governmental control can spiral into a dystopian hellscape of misery that has the external look of utopian perfection. Early in the story, the reader is introduced to the cloning system the government developed, probably with good intentions, to get rid of various physical diseases, social and food insecurity. But the result was a social caste system that divided people into levels of value that were signified by Greek letters. Huxley writes in the early chapters, solved by standard gammas, unvarying deltas, uniform epsilons, millions of identical twins, the principle of mass production at last applied to biology. He describes a process by which illness and human frailty are addressed essentially through gene modification. The result was a homogeneous group of people who still have various ailments and frailties that require further adjustments. Later, Mustafa Mond, who's the world state leader in the story, he further expands on this idea. He says, we also predestine and condition. We decant our babies as socialized human beings, as alphas or epsilons, as future sewage workers or future world controllers, but correcting himself said future directors of hatcheries, which was a term they used for cloning factories. The engineered social structures are also problematic, as the roles of each human being are predetermined and indoctrinated through repeated PA announcements and school lessons. The situation appears to have solved the problems of human existence, but misery and dissatisfaction remains in the story, with dependence on a drug that was supposed to bring happiness that they called soma. And this was supposed to be the solution that the government offered to its people. This novel challenges the assumption that government holds the key to solving the physical and societal ailments that we struggle with so often. The answer, Huxley argues, is not for government to impose efficient solutions that force individuals into conformity with narrow demographic categories. The answer that Huxley presents is for individuals to be free to make their own way in the world, to build an imperfect but beautiful society free from governmental overreach. The simple truth is that government can do some good things and can provide a framework for a society to thrive, but it will never be capable of solving the issues that we struggle with the most, because we are humans trying to solve spiritual problems.
There are so many unintended consequences to well-intentioned actions. Feels like a game you can't win.
That's it. There is another explanation. Unintended consequences. Oh, Tani, you did it.
Well, of course I did, darling. Did what?
All along, I've only been looking at one duck, but there's millions of ducks in here. In 1534, Douglas Winegar of Hawkhurst, England, gave his grandmother roses for her birthday. He picked them himself, walked them over to her. She was happy. Boom, 145 points. Now, here we go. In 2009, Doug Ewing of Skaggsville, Maryland, also gave his grandmother a dozen roses, but he lost 4 points because he ordered roses using a cell phone that was made in a sweatshop.
Solomon, as king of Israel, certainly encountered the dilemma of how a government should address oppression and physical ailments in a society. Here's how Solomon processed the problem in Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. He says, "Again I looked and saw all the oppression that was taking place under the sun. I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they have no comforter. Power was on the side of their oppressors. The oppressed have no comforter. And I declared that the dead who had already died are happier than the living who are still alive. But better than both is the one who has never been born, who has not seen the evil that is done under the sun. Solomon looked at the oppression and realized that he was powerless to solve the problem. Yet he was king, so if anyone had the power, he did, right? But there's a feeling of helplessness on the part of oppressed people who are stuck in a cycle that seems to perpetuate and even amplify the suffering they endure. It becomes the lens through which they see the world, an expectation that they will find people who are trying to push them down and out, people who wish them emotional and physical harm. We sometimes talk about this as having a chip on their shoulder. Someone who is used to having people in charge actively oppress them will expect the next person in charge to actively oppress them, and then they'll preemptively put up defensiveness as a protective mechanism. Now, if you ever meet someone who immediately presents as defensive, you can safely bet that they are interacting with you from a position of previous hurt and even oppression or abuse. So as Solomon works through chapter 4 of Ecclesiastes, he identifies a power structure that leads to the systematic oppression of the poor and the politically unimportant. And he tracks how people in power try to pass that power on to their next generation. He also identifies for us how to have true strength, regardless of the situation or the power structure we find ourselves in. So let's track Solomon's observations through Ecclesiastes chapter 4. If you read the first 3 verses, Solomon communicates that oppression stinks. That seems pretty logical, right? But people use their positions of power to cause other people to suffer, and many can't even find comfort to ease their suffering. Now, if you read verses 4 through 6, they are an observation of how ambitious people fight for positions of power through rivalry, promoting themselves to try to make it to the top of the power structure. And they're often consumed by their efforts. Solomon says they fold their hands and consume their flesh. Solomon then turns to how the ones in power have been so consumed by their work that they may not even have people that they can pass their riches or power to in the next generation. Now, on a side note, in ancient times, consolidating power as a king often meant getting rid of anyone who might make a claim to your throne. If you've ever watched Game of Thrones, you've seen that play out on TV. You don't have to look far to find stories of ancient kings who killed their own family members so they wouldn't try to take their power from them. Now, reading on in verses 9 through 12 of chapter 4, they seem out of place. You've probably heard the quote from this passage, "A cord of 3 strands is not quickly torn." And that wraps up this paragraph. But if you think of these verses in terms of how to do well in the midst of oppressive circumstances, you see Solomon communicating where true strength comes from. You see, power is not the same as strength. Political power might give you temporary influence over the lives of other people, but to have true strength is a different thing. In verses 9 through 12, we see strength through community. In verses 13 through 16, we see strength through wisdom and principled living. A person who suffers will do well if they have people with them to encourage them, and a person who suffers yet lives with principled wisdom will do better than a fool who has political power. But at the end, and we see this at the end of chapter 4, the poor but wise lad who comes out of prison to replace the ruined, foolish king, he finds his political power to be meaningless and impotent to address the issues of suffering and oppression of his people. The reader of this chapter is left with the sense that not only is political power incapable of adequately addressing issues of oppression, It often is the cause. So what are we to do? When Jesus sat and talked with a Samaritan woman at a well in John chapter 4, she started the conversation with a chip on her shoulder. She was used to being ignored and her enduring power structures designed to push her down and out. So when Jesus asked her for a drink of water as she was drawing in the middle of the day in a hot and arid climate, her first response was, "Why are you even talking to me? Aren't you a Jewish man who's too good for us Samaritan women?" And even when Jesus responds with a veiled analogy to eternal life, the woman reverts to a conversation about status. She says, "Are you greater than our father Jacob?" At each point, the woman misunderstands what Jesus is communicating. He tries to get her out of her oppressed mindset, and she finally understands when he gets to verses 25 and 26. The woman said, "I know that Messiah, called Christ, is coming. When he comes, he will explain everything to us." Then Jesus declared, "I, the one speaking to you, I am he." Now don't miss the fact that Jesus had no political power. He was not in a political position to address the oppression and suffering that the woman felt. Yet he did more to set people free from their suffering than any human king or dictator or prime minister or president ever could. All of them, throughout history combined, could not touch what Jesus did in his short life. And it wasn't through political activism or even working to change the system that Jesus changed lives. It was through reaching people on a personal level to heal, to accept, and to build relationships with poor and oppressed and marginalized people. The Samaritan woman at the well was not brought out of her oppression and suffering by an act of her government. Most likely, she continued to live in similar circumstances through the rest of her life. What changed was her mindset and her spiritual state, having received the life that Jesus offered. You see, we have a choice. We have the choice to look to government and political powers to find meaning and fulfillment and to try to change the system from oppression to support of suffering people. But what you will find is that while it is good and important for us to fight for the good of other people, even on a political level, you will find that political power is incapable of truly addressing the problem at its core. Jesus' example is to address the deeper spiritual needs of individuals and even commands his followers to be a friend to the downtrodden and brokenhearted. Political activism has its place, but on its own, it will leave us frustrated, disillusioned, and empty if we seek it as the final answer to the issues of human oppression and suffering. On January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring the official U.S. policy abolishing the practice of slavery. On June 19, 1865, slaves in Texas finally heard of the proclamation, and as the Confederacy collapsed, found their freedom. But that wasn't the end. Slavery was still allowed in certain states until the 13th Amendment was passed in December 1865. The last slaves on record were released in 1866. And then came Reconstruction and the Jim Crow laws, which, supported by the Supreme Court's separate but equal ruling, made it legal to divide our culture by race, primarily black and white, but in other ways as well. And the first Supreme Court ruling that began to correct that trend was only ruled about 70 years ago. That's not that long ago. And we're still dealing with the fallout from that whole dark stain on our country's history. The civil rights movement did much to bring the unfairness and inequality to light. But what you'll notice is that while we can make certain actions and government practices illegal, it requires the individual to take responsibility for their own attitudes and actions for those laws to have any weight. You see, it's more about how we as individuals view the dignity of those around us than the government's affirmation of that dignity. We see stories of how people violate that dignity every day, even in the face of laws making those practices illegal. So it comes down to individual responsibility. But wouldn't it be great if we affirmed the dignity of all human beings, not based on the law, not based on what the government said we should or should not do, but because of the image of God in all people, and because of the love that Christ has for all of us. See, Jesus shows us the better way. We'll see you again next time.